evening, everyone, and welcome to this another virtual DD. With me is Christina, and today we have Diana as a special guest, and she will talk about the hard skills. So welcome, Diana. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kenny. So I live in New York in the US, but I'm currently in Croatia. And I was hoping to do this from the pretty patio with the green and the birds chirping in the background. But unfortunately, the sun is direct on the patio at this time of day. So I'm sorry that instead we get the all the purple that ever was in our screen tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a talk bit that just sets context for what we're going to explore together. And then we're going to talk about 6 skills, and we'll understand better kind of what the point of that is when we get there. And while we're talking about the skills, we also have a Miro board to work together on and to collaborate on and to share thoughts and ideas there. So when we get to that part, I'm going to pause and introduce the board, and then I really encourage for the rest of the talk for you to feel free to interact and add. And my hope is that I end wiser than I begin. So that's what I'm really looking forward to hearing from everyone. So let me do the awkward trying to share my screen.
Yeah, so for the ones who are in Zoom, please just barge in. If you have questions, you can also chat. You can also raise your hands, and me and Christina will be moderating it. So please feel free to interact any way you like. Here we go.
Can you see the screen? You see the slide? Perfect. Okay. So I love this picture because that was February of 2020, the last time that I was together with people in person up until recently. And so I'm Diana Montalian, and I mostly professionally hang out on Twitter, and there's a great group of us. We all hang out together there too. So I highly encourage, if you're on the platform, to join in the conversation. So this is a short URL to the Miro board that we're going to be using a bit later on. So, and it's also, Kenny posted it in the chat. And later, if you've lost track of it, then we're happy to post it again. So I talked in the description about, I used the phrase from software to systems. And so I want to start by explaining what it is that I mean by that, or what my journey has been. So when I started in this particular phase of my career, I was coding and building and infrastructuring a single digital space. Right? So a piece of software defined the boundary in space that we worked inside. And the primary choreography, the time element, was page request, right? So we built big software for big internet properties, and almost everything was constructed around the relationship between user and page. Right? Those were the objective relationships that most of the coding was for. And so I call this feature-driven engineering, where someone would come along and say, we want this feature in this space so people can do this thing, and then that's what we would make. Meanwhile, everybody else was also doing the same thing, right? So, I mean, the internet and all of the digital knowledge and information is the ultimate knowledge system. And so what was happening more and more is that all of the clients that I worked with originally they were just busy reacting to this emerging system, because as more and more relationships came along, they needed more and more bridges to make these relationships. And so the software started looking like these Rube Goldberg machines, right? Where you just had rickety little pieces of code intersecting other pieces of code trying to keep up. And so where we eventually ended up in the midst of is restructuring space and time. Like page request is no more what the choreography was. We're building asynchronous services and event-based cloud-native platforms, and it wasn't what we weren't thinking about MySQL queries anymore. It was hypermedia data structures, and those were contextual. And so for me, the focus more and more shifted to relationships between software and between parts of the system, and the patterns that made for good relationships, right? That pretty quickly became almost my exclusive focus. And so over time, working on some big initiatives in different with different organizations, and then talking at conferences and having friends and colleagues going through this, a pattern began to emerge that everybody was attempting digital transformations and really savvy and good people, and inevitably hitting the same iceberg. And the iceberg was pretty much never, we don't have enough Kubernetes expertise. Like we were ready for that, right? Like we were prepared, we got training for that, but that was almost never the challenge. The challenge is that we don't think in systems, right? So the term the software crisis was coined 50 years ago, and it's still unsolved. Like as complexity increases, we don't and we can't keep up. We're trapped in the way that we think and communicate while we're trying to deliver more and more complex things. And more so, we don't think together in systems. Like we don't have the structures of thinking and communication that reinforce a type of thinking that lets us be comfortable in this emerging complexity. And there's always the Conway slide. Like I think it's a rule now that there has to be the Conway slide, but that's because it's right? That if you look at the code, then you know the structure of the organization, and vice versa. That the way we structure communication is exactly what we'll build, which makes sense, right? What we think is what we say, and what we say is what we do, and what we do is what we then build. And so there's really no difference between what we think about, envision, and talk about, and the system that we're trying to architect and deliver. So what do I mean by thinking in systems? So the challenge is that systems thinking is becoming a buzz phrase, and it really depends on the context. So there's a lot of marketing workshops. It's being used in academia. It's being used in the way Donella Meadows originally meant to. And those things often end up meaning somewhat different things, or at least enough to be confusing. And one of the reasons that it's confusing is that linear thinking is so ubiquitous that we usually just call it thinking. Like when we say thinking, we almost always mean some form of linear thinking. And now we rely on linear thinking to design and build and deploy software, right? Like we need it, and we need to be good at it. And I think everyone listening is likely good at, and needs to be good at linear thinking. It's what we're taught in school, but it's also the structure of education. right? It's a very linear model of building one thing on another. Linear thinking is, we want it to be predictable and rational, top down, repeatable, dualistic. I mean, it's especially in the US, right? Everything is, right? Gay and straight, left and right. That's it. That's all there is. Like there's this giant excluded middle or not nuance, and concerned with control. So the challenge with linear thinking is that it works really well in the space of software, but it doesn't help us solve systemic challenges, especially as complexity increases. And this was a client years ago who said one of my favorite quotes over coffee, which was, "Agile was invented because reality refuses to bow down to power," which I really want to put on a t-shirt. But by this, the idea that we're trying to figure things out in a world that wants to enforce a more top-down and concerned with control approach. So I use the phrase nonlinear thinking. By this, I mean systems thinking. I mean pattern thinking. I mean parallel thinking. If you read The Fifth Discipline, which is one of my new favorite books, which is about learning organizations, it's systems thinking. Like it's really all the same thing. And the biggest thing, probably the most important word from today, is it's something that we have to practice. It's a practice that we do every day. And the better we get at nonlinear thinking, the more we'll take on more and more challenges and need to get better. There's no arrival, there's no enlightenment moment for nonlinear thinking. But it is making sound decisions while happily immersed in complexity and uncertainty. So I often say it's a joke that's not a joke. If I had $1 for every time someone has said the word concrete to me, then I wouldn't have to work as an architect anymore, because I could retire. And concrete is a good and essential thing. It's just something you need to be very careful about where you pour it, right? Because it's also very persistent. So notice that in this description, there's no Kafka, right? Because nonlinear thinking is a technology agnostic skill set. We need it for every single type of technology we will ever use. And so there's no whiteboard test, right? It's very holistic, and it focuses on the structure of things, patterns and relationships, on the process, how we think and work, and on the implementation, on the tools we use, because that really matters, right? The tools we use are also make or break what we're trying to do. We are limited by the tools that we have access to, but it's not seeing those things as separate things. So nonlinear thinking is focused on how relationships produce effect. So we tend to focus on this and that, and nonlinear thinking is more concerned with the and. So we say this and that, but we don't spend a lot of time considering the and part. So it's how you achieve something that couldn't exist without the together part, right? Without the and part. Like when you take this piece of software and that piece of software and you put them in harmony together, you build a relationship, then you're going to get qualities that neither of them have alone. And nonlinear thinking is about taking that aspect into consideration and keeping it part of the communication process. So before we get to lots of really good ways to cultivate this skill set, I have two pieces of bad news, and they're both pretty big bad news. So, but it's important because it's important to know what we're up against. So one of the hardest things in my work, especially over the last 5 or 8 years, is that I can have the experience that everything is working against me. And when I talk to other people, I often hear that frustration that they're in the midst of some transformation and it really feels like everything is working against them as they're trying to do this. And the thing is, it is, right? It is. Everything is often working against you when you're doing nonlinear thinking. And this is because of counterintuitiveness. So Jay Forrester, who I just love reading his thinking, very early pioneer of systems, he talked about going into a company and doing an analysis. And what he's looking for is a leverage point, a place where you can make a change that will actually make an impact in the system that he's analyzing. And what he started to discover, which we've seen later in a whole bunch of more modern stories, is that people often know where the problem is. Like if you go and talk to people about where the bottlenecks are in their system, they often point right to them. But the other side is that they're often doing the exact wrong thing. They're pushing the problem in the exact wrong direction. They're making it, we're making it worse. And this is just a human thing. We actually probably have to do this most of the time. It's also how we learn. But it does make it harder to communicate when you're solving systems challenges, because you're often going against this tide and this gravity. And even more so, as Donella Meadows says, that we know from bitter experience that because of counterintuitiveness, when we do discover a systems leverage point, hardly anybody will believe us, right? And I call this the 18-month rule, and it's really 6 to 18 months. But if I am saying, here's a systems change that needs to happen, and everybody's saying, no, 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 and you can have my software when you take it out of my cold, dead hands, no, 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 then it's 6 to 8 months before I'm in a meeting in which someone says my words back to me. And it starts to become something that people are engaging with. Christina, do you have a question?
Yeah, how do you know that it is going in the wrong direction?
Right. So you don't. I mean, that's what the answer is, that one of the most challenging things about this is creating some confidence in your ability to discern. And so over time, I have come to see that I'm right much more often than I'm not, or I'm at least partially right. But even when I'm standing up for a leverage point, I'm not sure that I'm standing up for the right thing either. And so this is why I think it's so important to practice the type of skills that we're going to talk about, because you really do live in this uncertainty yourself when you find that they're going in the wrong direction. But for me, it's oversimplification. But when it doesn't solve, when you just keep ending up with the same problem reoccurring again and again and again, that's a pretty good indicator. And that pattern is usually like people solve a problem, but it doesn't solve the problem. Also, another good test is that if nothing changed in the structure of the people, then nothing probably changed in the structure of the system or the software either, right? Yeah. Right, but it's an excellent question. Yeah.
Thank you.
So there's two more blockers that are really the same blocker. This is the other challenge. We are spectacularly terrible at nonlinear thinking. So we are so tangled in our own cognitive biases and our own logical fallacies, our own mental models, our own conditioning, our linear conditioning, that we really have to practice to be able to disentangle ourselves from those things, to get better at nonlinear thinking. So it's generally not a thing that comes easy. And harder, we don't know that we're terrible at it. So it's actually a paradox of in order to know that you're bad at nonlinear thinking, you have to be good at nonlinear thinking so you can see that. So it's it's this sort of never-ending paradox of getting better at nonlinear thinking only to see how much worse you are at it than you thought you were before you even started. So, and that's actually good because it's very motivating and invigorating, but it is also challenging because people who aren't good at nonlinear thinking are very certain that they are. Like the worse you are, the more certain you are that you're good at it. So fortunately, Carl Jung says that only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. So we, in the fullness of systems, we really do live amidst this paradox where we have a practice that doesn't lead us it doesn't lead us to certainty, but it does lead us to more and more skill, and I would say more and more wisdom, which is really fundamentally what makes paradigms shift. Right? Knowledge and information alone won't do it, right? And the last skill is what I think does, but let's start with the not as hard. So we're going to talk about 6 skills. And inside of the skills, we're going to talk about practices, and they're doorways. So you can enter wherever you like, right? So they all intersect and intermingle. They all matter. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to switch for a second to the
So what you're saying, the skills aren't linearly connected to each other.
The skills are not linearly connected to each other, correct? And that's, in a way, the hard thing about the skills too. So I am working with a coach right now who I love hate, more hate most days than love hate, because there's aspects of this that are real blind spots for me personally. Like they're just doors that I do not want to open. And now that I'm being encouraged to open them, it's very uncomfortable. So that's part of the challenge here too, is that we often come deep into our own limitations when we're practicing this, and that's uncomfortable and we don't want to do it. And we want to go back to the things that we already know we're good at.
Yeah.
You know?
So, and this is, I think, a lot seems struggling, right? Because everything is interconnected. Yeah. You don't really generally get a approach to, well, how everyone wants a sort of linear approach to it. That's always a challenge, right? Teaching these things or starting with these things. You can start everywhere, but then where do I start?
Right, exactly. And so I love that you just said this, because we're doing this as the 2-hour hands-on at DDD EU in a couple of weeks. And the first hour, we're practicing some of the stuff that we're talking about here. And the second hour, that is the question. Where do we start? I'm going to give a real life big systems problem that I've been working on that has no linear solution. And that's the question, like, where do we start when all of these things are entangled? And the answer is what it always is: it depends. It depends, it depends. And figuring out what it depends on is I took a slide out. Now I kind of regret it, because when in Conway's law about the structure of organizations, I would say that the ideal structure of organizations is one that supports the ability to discover what it depends on. When it depends, you're actually able to figure out what it depends on and decide how you want to prioritize. So I am going to talk about the 6 skills, and in each of them, I'm going to give some examples of practices. But there are many, many, many practices, and there's also books that you can read, or talks that you can watch, or really good quotes. Like, there's lots of ways to pick them up, and I'm really hoping to learn from you in these ways. And so for each one of the boards, while I'm talking about the practices, we have these the blue stickies, which you can move around or make copies of. And those are for adding any practices that occur to you, or that you've practiced, or that you know, or any books or anything you would like to add to a particular subject. And then we have the red stickies under challenges, and that's your pain. Like, to feel free to share in any of these areas if you've experienced pain or challenges or blockers, or if you think what I'm saying is doesn't resonate with your experience or whatever. And then we also have the yellow ones for notes and questions. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the slides and talk through the practices that I'm recommending and what I mean, like in this case, what I mean by crafting conceptual integrity. But while I'm talking, feel free to sticky away. We'll pause a little bit in between them to give people a little bit of time. I'm going to go through each of the 6 so that the people that just kind of want to hear what they are, like that's how they want to spend the time here, will hear them. And then I'm going to switch completely to the board and we'll discuss. And so maybe we'll discuss, take a look at what people have said with each one, or maybe there'll be 1 or 2 that people find most interesting, or there's a lot to say about them, and we'll focus the discussion on that. So really will be up to y'all what we focus on, but also like really do feel free to just, even if you have thoughts that aren't fully formed, and especially recommendations, because every time I talk to other people, I hear about something that I had never considered before, and it opens up a whole nother avenue. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to the slides. And there are, Kenny and Christina and Dom is here as well. If anybody needs any help in the Miro board or has a whatever, do feel free to just put a sticky with their name on it and they will stop me. Or just shout out here in Zoom. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can communicate through stickies on the board.
Yeah, we also chat in Zoom or chat in YouTube. We also watch that. Do you want us to barge in if anyone writes anything on the notes and questions, or do you want to take that after your introduction?
Yeah, we'll do that after. That's kind of what I want, is to give people the ability to be leisurely about notes and questions, and then we can come back to them afterwards, so that they don't have to worry about necessarily interrupting if they're not comfortable doing that. Just go ahead and put them there and we'll get back to them. And if there is something you'd like to say about it, then do put your name so we can call at the end. But if you do it anonymously, that's totally fine too. And we'll come back to that. Okay. All right. Nope. Sorry. Mm-hmm. Are you seeing the slides again?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry. User error, click the wrong button, then clicked the same button wrongly again. Okay, so crafting conceptual integrity. So the Fred book slides, right? That conceptual integrity is the most important consideration in systems design. Now, the tricky thing is he didn't really define what that is. And he does mention, and it's what I often use, that it's creating harmony from a cacophony of, and I'm sure in our work lives, we experience this all the time, where there's a lot of good, but independent and uncoordinated ideas, right? So creating harmony from a cacophony of many good, but independent and uncoordinated ideas. And the reason that I really like this quote is it's every code base I've ever worked on. I could describe it as many good, but independent and uncoordinated ideas is when it starts to get unwieldy. And that increases as complexity increases, right? The amount of impact that the independent but uncoordinated has, and then we try and control it. And then you end up mostly focused on control as opposed to making these ideas, giving these ideas life. So crafting conceptual integrity is more of an intention than a skill. It's something that you decide to make part of what you do professionally. And when all else fails, you can come back to this question of, am I doing something that helps to create that helps to integrate ideas and helps to strengthen and make them be able to work together, again, the and part? Or am I encouraging the independent and uncoordinated, or reinforcing silos when we already know the silos are not helping us? So one of the practices that is, again, sort of more intentional is to think cross-functionally. And this is just simply one of the best lessons that I've ever learned in my career. Is my team and I worked for 6 months to architect a major transformation that is basically going to rip out the most business essential aspect of a system to replace and modernize it. And as part of doing this, I had to work with the accountant, because we weren't going to get $3 million to spend on it unless the accountant did all the things she needs to do in order to show in her language what this means. And it really brought home for me the importance of looking at systemic challenges from multiple points of view on purpose, right? So we get this when the shift towards user stories helped us to think of how people use our code and not just speak in the language of code. But there's more than just user and engineer relationship in a system. Right? There's usually easily five or six different ways of looking at a challenge that help bring it more into focus. And so now I specifically go and try and look at people who see a systemic challenge very differently than me, so that I can understand it better. Learning about non-tech systems. So it's always surprising to me. One of my favorite books this year was Mark Bittman, Animal Vegetable Junk. The entire book is about agriculture. He talks nothing about tech in this book, and yet it is covered with my highlights because there is so much overlap between agricultural system and technology system that I quote him probably as often as people who work in tech. So these are the few, like everyone sort of has on their shelves books, so you've probably come across. So this is a pattern language. This is actually about buildings and architecture. And I read it and I moved stuff around in my house, and I cannot tell you how much better my living space is and the positive impact it had on my life. But it also helped me to think about relationships between parts in a way that helped me to think better about technology. One of my favorite books in the last 5 years, also about actual architecture. She's a professor, I don't want to say Stanford or whatever, but there are so many things in this book that I immediately could apply to systems technology, systems design. And she talks a lot about the overlap between literal design of space and games and video game design. And this is everybody please, let's all read this so that we actually start to develop a language to talk about the things that are still invisible to us, like shifting the paradigms of systems and leverage points and feedback loops. These things are really helpful words for us to be able to use when we try and talk about problems in a nonlinear way. So thinking cross-functionally, learning about non-tech systems, And the last one is studying relevant to you patterns. So I have to be very careful with this third one because it's my absolute favorite. Like the reason, this is what I love about my job. Like I love CQRS and messaging and event-driven patterns, enterprise integration patterns, decomposition, observability, testing patterns, DevOps, all of the things that in my work are what I can use to help design good relationships in an emerging system. So they're not the things that are most essential to me would not necessarily be the patterns that are most essential to you. But a lot of the people that I have been learning from keep kind of coming back to this word, right? Patterns, and being pattern focused and pattern familiar and having a really good vocabulary around patterns. Okay. So that is the first one. And so now my question is, should I pause a little bit here? Do people want to make stickies, or is it pretty quiet there and I should just keep going? Is there enough time while I'm talking to just, yeah? Okay, good.
There are some stickies on the board, so
great, good.
So maybe we can go into them if you want.
Do you want to pause and go into them, or should we finish the
what do you think is best?
I think let's finish the overview, so then I can put this away and then we can just sort of relax and talk about whatever people want to talk about.
What works for you the best?
Let's do that. I think that. Yeah, I think that. Also, we'll stop having to watch me go back and forth in screen sharing. And yeah, Christina, you. Yeah.
She did a thumbs up. So.
Is it thumbs up? Oh, sorry, not hand raising. Okay, thumbs up. Okay.
Everybody is writing, so it's cool because you're explaining. You don't explain too fast. We have time to think, and there are a lot of post-its already.
Good, great. Okay, and so here's what I'll say. If anybody wants me to pause for a couple of minutes to work on a particular one, just holler, and then that's what we'll do. And otherwise, I'll continue, and then we'll switch to the board. So the second one is cultivate self-awareness. And this is really interesting because I get a lot of woo-woo. Ooh, this is like a woo-woo talk. Like when I talk about this particular skill set, but we can't improve our thinking if we aren't aware of our thinking. And we can't improve our experiences if we aren't aware of our experiences, right? So to create conceptual integrity in the world, we have to create conceptual integrity in ourselves. And for me, this is really hard. That I don't know, like I have a whole bunch of competing things. In the times in which I play the role of product owner, I'm the worst. I want everything. I don't want to prioritize. I don't really know what to prioritize. Like, you know, that we're tangled, right? We're not necessarily good at nonlinear thinking because of all our entanglements. And without some way to disentangle ourselves, we're not going to make much progress in improving our thinking. And so nonlinear approaches are really a transformation from the inside out. And this, if Conway's law is true, that an organization, that the code basically looks like the structure of communication in an organization, then my code represents my own inner structure. Right? It's how I talk to myself. It's how I think is how I'll structure my code. So if I want to build different things, then I also have to think differently. And I can only do that through self-awareness. So my practice is mostly journaling. And by this, I do mean keeping a diary that I get up every morning stupidly early and make coffee, and I write by hand for about an hour. You do not have to start there, even a page. But it is the way that I have conversations and think through things and make lists. And I actually don't know a lot about how I'm thinking or feeling about something without that time to work it through physically by hand. It's never worked for me to type. And there's a book called The Artist Way, where she calls them morning pages, which is, she helps writers in creative block and all of this. But I think it's true for technologists, because we're intellectually creative, right? This is what we do. The other thing with journaling that I've started to do, especially because I'm never in the room with people, is to take notes during meetings. Because what's happening is I'm in a meeting and someone says something that really pisses me off. And then I'm trying to sort of manage or control, like I'm not really working with my own reaction or response here. So I've started to take notes in meetings, not to record what's happening, but to record what I'm thinking, which I wouldn't necessarily need to say out loud, but I can become aware of my own thinking and responses by taking notes. And then meditation in any form. So there's mindfulness has become a really big word, which in, sitting and paying attention, watching your thoughts. But really gardening can be meditation, movement, yoga, these things, any way. Joseph Campbell said his form of meditation was underlining passages while he read. So I really don't think there's a reason to be prescriptive about it, as much as it's just time in which your attention is focused on your own experience. And then the last one is again less of a practice and more of an intention. But Einstein said he believed in intuition and inspiration, that he feels that he's right, but he doesn't know that he is. And this was, Christina, I use the word intuition to describe how do you know that you're right. But I don't like that word because it can mean different things to different people. But also my intuition can be shockingly wrong, as past relationships would indicate. Like, how really wrong my intuition can be. Because what we think is intuition is often conditioning, right? And so at the same time, though, when we're solving systemic challenges, like Einstein, we tend to have a sort of an inner compass leading us in a good direction, and we don't have the words yet to say why we're looking at what we're looking at. And we really want to learn to trust that. And self-awareness helps us to cultivate intuition.
What my wife always asks me when she sees me getting into some kind of trigger, or she always asks, what are you now doing? And I ask myself that when I feel myself getting into a sort of like, this autopilot, that I always ask myself, what are you actually trying to achieve at this moment? And then it helps to self-reflect.
Yeah, right. As opposed to just be caught up in it, right?
Yeah.
Swept up in it. Yeah. As I think I mentioned, the love-hate relationship with the coach, her thing with me is, where do you feel this in your body? There's not a body. I don't have a body. Like, I'm having conversations about abstract things. What do you mean? Where am I feeling it in my body? But I can tell you that I've suffered the most harm in meetings with technologists who have no connection whatsoever to emotion or physical experience, right? That we're just kind of talking heads. And so really that grounding and the ability to have embodied experiences has made me much better at my job. I do not like it. I like tra-la-la. I like to get caught up, stay caught up in the drama. I don't like it coming at me, but I don't mind producing it, apparently. Which is the perfect segue to the next skill, and which is respond rather than react. And so you might have heard of the beer game. Has anyone heard of the beer game? So the beer game is been done again and again and again with CEOs of major brands, very experienced people, and students who are getting MBAs. And the beer game is So we would take us as a group, and we'd split one group of us. We are the retailer selling beer. And one group of us, we are the wholesaler who is distributing the beer from the brewery. And then some lucky group of us gets to be the brewery, right? So we have a system for delivering beer, and it is when the distributor comes to the retailer gives a piece of paper and says, next time bring me 4 cases or whatever beer comes in, like for like giant boxes, pallets, whatever. And then the game begins with a music video gets made, and some super cool youngin has a beer in the video, and suddenly more people want the beer. And they go to the retailer and they want the beer. Okay, go. What happens the vast majority of time, like greater than 90% of the time, is the entire system collapses. The entire system collapses, and you end up with almost nobody gets what they want. And then you have giant warehouses full of beer that no one buys in the end, right? That's where it ends up going. The whole thing collapses. Very, very rarely, even very experienced people succeed at the beer game. And this is because there's a lot of panic in systems, that everybody acts from their own point of view, right? In their own component. We have 3 components in the system, and these components interact. And the retailer, for example, never talks to the brewer. Like, it's very rare that somebody in the retail shop will say, hey, I'm going to find out what's actually going on at the source. Like, that doesn't happen. They escalate and escalate and escalate orders in anticipation of what they think the demand is going to be. But there's a big lag time in the feedback loop in the system. And then even more so, there's a lot of blame in systems. And when you ask everybody at the end why the system collapsed, they blame the wrong things, right? Just because counterintuitiveness. As a matter of fact, there's a great story of one guy left the room very quickly after this conversation, and he came back, and the person, it's the guy who wrote the 5th Discipline, he asked him what happened. And he said, I just called HR to stop them from firing someone that I had decided to fire, to blame them for a distribution problem that I now realize that he's just a fall guy. It isn't his fault. This is a systemic problem, right? It's not his fault. It's a systemic problem. We need to change the system around him so that he can succeed. So in nonlinear thinking and systems thinking, learning to respond rather than react is essential. And you're gonna react. Oh my God, I can't tell you the feeling I get in my gut when I listen to things that are happening, and means or suggestions to people, that reacting is our very first normal response to things. And so we need to drop out of our reaction. And so this is where we come back to the body, right? Being in the body, or to Kenny's wife's question of what are you doing? Becoming aware of what you're doing. And rhythmic activity is a really great way of doing it, right? And we know this. Oh my God, the nights I spent looking for the bug, 3, 4, 5 hours looking for the bug in my code, and I went for a walk and I come back and then it's really obvious. Or eat pizza. I don't know why pizza or a walk. Pizza does not count as rhythmic activity, but it also works. Gandhi spun on a spinning wheel to make thread like every day. This was a big part of his practice. What'll happen is when there's a challenge that's going on, we panic, we react, we push in the wrong direction, and we need to drop out of that. And one of the ways that you do it, singing, going for a run, doing hobbies, throwing a frisbee for a dog, whatever it is that moves you out of the reaction, so then you can come back and form a response. The second is practicing yes and. So yes and is an improv technique. So when I was doing improv, before we would go out, we played the yes game, which is basically Simon Says, if you know Simon Says, which is somebody would say, touch your head, and everyone says yes, and they do this. And then someone would say something else, and everyone says yes, and we do that. And that's because in improv, if you're on stage and someone says, oh, a cat, oh my God, a cat, and someone else says, that's not a cat, which is every meeting I'm ever in, right? Oh, that looks like a graph. Graphs don't scale. No, we are the biggest no culture in the world. Someone is wrong. We're going to say no. Now you can, like someone maybe invites me for dinner and I can say, oh yes, thank you so much. I love your cooking and I'm really looking forward to it. And I already have an engagement that night. And so we would need to do it another time, right? Like it's not saying okay to everything. It's just first acknowledging what's happening and then working with what's happening. And so cultivating the ability to respond with yes and as opposed to no every time, and cultivating that in the people around you is going to leave space for creative next. So this is what makes improvisation hysterical to watch. Like maybe you've seen Whose Line Is It Anyway? It was in the UK and also in the US if you've not seen improv. And it's because people are leaving space for each other to continue on creating together. And in technology, we need the same.
I just put the YouTube video, just as you spoke, I just put it on Miro, the questions only. I try to do that in some workshops or training, just do the questions only. You can only do a conversation, but ask questions.
I love that.
It's
I
hard.
love that
it's
game.
Really hard. It's really hard.
So that's an improv game I've actually done. And it's very, very, very hard. I've seen real professional improv people do it and they kick my butt. Like it's so hard, but it's fun. And that's a great example. The reason we have to practice yes and is it's so hard. I fail all the time at it, even though it's my intention. It's so hard. And then the third thing is try something. So when we experience uncertainty, what arises in us is doubt. Doubt is our experience of uncertainty. And doubt is neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It's just doubt. We experience doubt about things that we need to be doubtful about, and we experience doubt about things that we have absolutely no reason whatsoever to doubt. It's just uncertainty. And you cannot think your way out of doubt. You can't talk other people out of their doubt. They have to have a different experience. Because doubt is an experience, we have to have an experience in order to help doubt. Words, talk, thinking don't help our experience of doubt. So what's the smallest little thing that you could try? Kind of like someone puts food in front of you that you don't even know what it is, like, and you don't know, like maybe it's poison. I don't know. You don't know, like, a little bite, a little taste, a little follow-up, like try something. A little bit of something as opposed to reacting. See if there's a little something to work with, a little something you can try to see if what's happening might in fact be workable. Yeah? Okay. So that is how not to react. But what is a response? How do we build a response? And I call it building systemic reasoning, argumentation. This is one I'm going to be really careful because I actually do whole day long workshops on this. It's a very, very, very simple thing, as you'll see. It's very easy for me to explain. It's very hard to do. It's a skill that we practice again and again. But the basics is that you're collectively arriving at the best possible conclusion under the circumstances, right? This is defeasible. It's under your circumstances at your moment, this is the best possible conclusion. This does not make it right, and it doesn't make it right in a different circumstance when conditions are uncertain. So if you know what to do, you don't need nonlinear thinking. You just do it. This is when you don't know what to do, or you can't necessarily know what to do. And conditions are always uncertain, right? That one of the challenges we have is this idea that we can create certainty through linear thinking. And maybe people can. I've tried to do it most of my life. It fails spectacularly because we are part of a system where we can't actually predict impact of everything, that all of our decisions, but we still need to act. So I call it opinion-driven engineering. And different cultures are more this than others. There's at least one that I've worked in that is 150% this, which is somebody says, I have an idea, I have a recommendation, I have a question, and they get flooded with everybody else's opinion. This is my opinion. And from that, you're supposed to come to some sort of decision. So this changes that model. And it is, the goal is to enable other people to make up their own mind. Right? It's a method of inquiry in support of an idea, an action, or a theory. So you have an idea, action, or theory. How do you inquire sufficiently to help other people come to the same conclusion that you have, which you hope that they do? So we switch from opinion-driven to giving reasons that support your idea, action, or theory. Generally 3. That's a good rule, that you need at least 3 reasons that support your idea, action, or theory. So when you have your 3 reasons, then you strengthen them. And by strengthen them, I mean, is it true? So for example, I made a recommendation that included something that I think it was Kafka, that a tool doesn't do, that I thought it did. Maybe it used to, and I don't know, it doesn't do. So is it true? Does it follow? If I say, I have an idea, and here's my reason, and my second reason, and my third reason, if I say my 1, 2, 3, does it come at the end, therefore, this makes sense, right? Do they follow each other? Do they hang together? Do my reasons give you a good, strong experience of having some confidence in what it is that I'm saying? The other things that are really important that we forget so much in tech culture is it contextually matterful? Maybe your idea is absolutely true. It's the best idea I've ever heard in my entire life. And your reasons are so sound that I am floored by them. But maybe right now, it is not the most important thing for me to pay attention to. Like, all systems have all kinds of competing needs for time, energy, and attention. So why is the idea, action, or theory you're recommending really matterful right now to the mission that we're serving? And is it sufficient? So again, to earlier thoughts, have you proactively partnered to uncover blind spots? Right? Have you talked to people with different perspectives on the challenge so that you're seeing it from as 360 a view as you can? And then strengthen them together, right? So this is the sufficient part. Like, get feedback from other people with different types of viewpoints and expertise. Is this hanging together for them? Do they have information or expertise that can help you to discern? And this is something that we often really shy away from. It's very strange. Like, it's sort of this competitive expertise thing where we don't want other people to be smarter than us or something. I don't know. I feel it myself, but in general, the reason, I never want to be the smartest person in the room, because I always want other people's expertise to be improving my ability to come to conclusions. Christina?
I think this last part is maybe the most important one, because otherwise it is not systemic anymore. It is it's my reasoning, my thoughts. I could be a boss and tell everyone that's the reality, but I would lie to myself, because it isn't. It becomes, it stops being something systemic.
Agreed.
If it is not done together or accepted.
Agreed.
Or maybe for sure challenged.
Yeah, and it's I don't know what to do about this yet, but if you're doing systemic reasoning in a very top-down, opinion-driven culture, it doesn't have a whole lot of impact. It does need to be a cultural practice, not exclusively, but so systemic reasoning, also called argumentation. As soon as somebody in the room takes the position, I don't care what you say. So for example, change my mind, the meme of, here's my opinion, change my mind. That's not systemic reasoning, but it's 75% of meetings that I'm in. Like here's my idea. And you have to, you're on the defense instead of being on the offense.
Yeah.
And so, but even if people individually change this, we take so much of the pointiness out of culture, like so much of the challenge of having to argue as opposed to form responses, that the people who then people will sort of melt more towards doing it together. So even in a culture in which it sort of seems hopeless, it's still really beneficial to do the first two, because then you're having some impact on the culture around you. But I agree with you. If it's not together, then it doesn't have a lot of impact, unfortunately. So.
Because I'm seeing now on Miro, it is called build collective reasoning.
Collective. Oh, did I say? Yeah, sorry, I do. Right.
And this is what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
This is a collective thing.
Yes. Yeah. I can't decide what to. I was calling it argumentation because that's sort of its academic phrase, and that just brings up argument. So collective reasoning, systemic reasoning, and then I keep changing my phrases. But yes, collective reasoning. And what I can say unequivocally, 100%, is the teams that I've worked on where we've done really hard things and been able to deliver them, and they're really good at this. And the teams that aren't, like, yes. they get very little done. So
because this is why this is really, I understand that you are switching between them, but this is everything. If I can't argument, if I can't tell why I am thinking what I'm thinking, or why I'm proposing what I'm proposing, then the others can't understand, can't challenge, can't reject, can't accept.
Right.
It stops becoming a team. It is only somebody wants something, and everybody is frustrated.
Right. Exactly. No one's really listening. You don't have a lot of yes and, but also it's a very radical thing to suggest that the best we can do is help other people make up their own mind in a linear culture that wants top-down control. I tell you my vision. This is leadership. I will tell you my vision so all of you can align with my vision and then go code it. I don't actually want to do that. That's not, but I also do. Right? If I do have a vision, I have a vision of a target system change, for example, and I do want people to build that, right? So my work is sharing what I'm thinking so that people can make up their own minds, and improving it and strengthening it as I learn more.
Yes, they can. You don't have to.
Yeah, right.
I'd like to point out one thing just really quick. I think your struggle of switching between the words systemic and collective is because I think your idea is the combination of those two words. It's not just collective reasoning, which might be groupthink.
Yes.
It's about collectively doing systemic reasoning. And I think maybe if you just use both words as collective systemic reasoning, you will get your point across better, because it's the combination of those two is what you're talking about, as my understanding, if I understand you correctly.
Yes, no, that's yay. I want it tattooed. That's exactly it. Yeah. As soon as you said it, collective systemic yes. Why? Oh, you know why I didn't? Because I was being dualistic and saying this one and that one, and I couldn't see how they merge. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, for sure. Okay. So great. We're on number 5, and the last one is pretty quick. So we're coming to the end of the slide part and ready to move into the discussion part. And this one is make artifacts. And this is the an engineer once said to me, this is the thing you say that makes me cry, which is the write things down. Write things down. He said, I want my code to speak for me. And I'm like, that would be great if that works. Except nobody's listening to your code. They're listening to what your code does or what they want your code to do or this. And so this, what I mean really by this is model together a lot and create spaces for thinking to evolve. And I do not mean concrete spaces in which we write the thing that will be the law on tablets, the 10 commandments forever. It's always defeasible. Like when we make an artifact, it can always be wrong later. Like circumstances change. And by artifacts, I mean anything. Emails can be an artifact. Jira tickets are an artifact. Models are an artifact. Documents are an artifact. But that the crafting and making artifacts together is the space in which we think together. So one of the things that really helps or is important with artifacts is trying to keep the why and the what and the how connected. I tell a story that's absolutely true. I was in a meeting with other architects and there was a debate about the adoption of Kubernetes. And I said, why? I missed this part. Why do we need Kubernetes? And he said, because we don't have Kubernetes. So we need Kubernetes. Okay, so that wouldn't be the why. Like that would not be the why, right? Why? What's the thing Kubernetes is going to do that is essential to the mission and essential to what it is that we're doing now? And so this can really be, we've done this very light touch with just Jira. In Jira, there's a link to a 1-page document that describes why and what that we're then trying to figure out the implementation. Creating layers and artifacts. This is my absolute favorite thing, right? Is that if I'm going to have a conversation with the CEO, for example, she's going to want to know a very high level summary of things. And she's not going to interact with some of the technology decisions that we're making. But that high level document can have links to link down deeper, and those documents can link down deeper until you eventually end up at the code, right? And so we're designing systems. And for me, knowledge and information systems. So we want hypermedia links in our artifacts, right? Like if you mention something, you don't have to go into detail in this artifact. You can link to something that goes into detail. And so we want to get creative about the interrelationships between our artifacts and using interrelationships as a way of helping people understand just enough of what they need to. And the last one is exploring frameworks that describe the system. So Chris Richardson, I love this. He said, because it was so resonant with my experience too, I go in and I ask a question. If I want to understand your system, where would I go? And so far, neither of us have had a client experience in which there was an answer to that question. There's no place where the system, there's documentation. If I ask, how do I set up my local dev environment? I get a link right away. There's an artifact for that. But if I want to understand the system, where would I go? And this is in part because it's very difficult to create artifacts that describe a system that don't immediately become obsolete, or like it's, and so, and there's like TOGAF on one end of a spectrum, but I borrow things from that. It's sort of like reading classic literature, and I might still write a novel about modern life, but you know, you can take things from it. But there's a lot of different ways to create frameworks and interrelationships, and they're worth considering without over, like, I'm not suggesting I'm not suggesting safe as much as just because we had to, because for Kenny we had to mention that. But I
I'm
am
very
saying,
sorry, I have to leave now. I have an engagement. And you said TOGAF, you said safe. What the hell?
well,
You
and these
mean
are all like
you mean your release train
Yeah,
is actually now.
that's the next one.
Here you go.
But I do empathize with the problem that these constructs are trying to solve, and so I encourage all of us to get involved in non-linear ways as opposed to linear solutions for describing our systems. Okay, the last one, and then we'll take a breath and switch. It's what I call integration leadership. So the form of leadership in systems that I advocate for is the ability to synthesize knowledge, experience, and good judgment into decisions based on valid reasons. And that if we see primarily our work as this synthesizing, and I don't mean our own knowledge and experience exclusively, right? If we are synthesizing our own and other people's knowledge and experience and good judgment into decisions based on valid reasons, we're going to get very close to that kind of synergy that we want from the cacophony of many good but independent and uncoordinated ideas. This is my definition of wisdom. Which is bad because it's also not definition of wisdom, because you can't really define wisdom, but synthesizing knowledge, experience, and good judgment into decisions based on valid reasons. And if we ask ourselves when we are making recommendations or decisions, if we've done this synthesis, then we're often better than we would be if we didn't ask ourselves this question. And there's many things to say about what good judgment is, but that would be a whole nother talk. So I won't repeat them because we have them in the board now. So yeah, good. I had another thought, but it went out of my head. So I'm gonna stop with the slides and go into the board and ask what you guys think about what we'd like to do with the you guys have been watching it, so should we take a peek at what people have put, or is there one or two that we might want to focus on? What do you think?
So you want to go through them in a non-linear way?
Melissa Farjas.
I'm sorry, say again.
I think someone wanted to speak. Anyone unmuted themselves? Does anyone have a question?
I suggest that we take two things from one and then move on to another and take two things so that we don't just spend time all on one thing, on one of the areas.
Go.
Great. Okay. So I go here and then pick maybe two or three of the notes that are here, focused on those, and move on? Yeah? Is that the suggestion? Yeah? Okay. I love that suggestion. Okay. All right. Let's see. So yes. Yeah, these are all really good. Expose your design coherent. I'd be really interested to do coherent probes.
Yeah, I put that on.
Yeah.
But I'm not an expert. I took the Kinevin course, And they were like, if you're in a problem in a complex system, you want to do probes which are coherent. So for instance, if you want to, coherency means, are they solving the same thing for the same problem? So you want to do, so as far as I know, again, no expert, you can say, okay, there's the problem. Let's give 2 or 3 of these probes the same amount of time and the same amount of money. See after a month or 2 how it's going, but always have in place what are the failure signals and what are the success signals, so you can, well, safely fail the probe if you need to, right? So
yeah, that's, and
I've tried them once for myself with, well, some good, how do you say it, some good outcomes, but at least you can compare the 3, right? Which one is working and which isn't. If you're on a crossroad deciding which one should I take, left or right, and, well, maybe do them both for the same time, for the same money, and do a real experiment, well, a probe, and see how it's going. But make sure they can safely fail. That's the...
Yeah, the conference that I was just at, James Copeland gave one of the keynotes and was talking about something very similar, but also taking pieces. Like, so let's say you say the mixture of these 3 technologies or these 3 technologies could both work for us. But then it isn't even just either or, like this one or this one. It's also, well, these things from this one and these things from this one, and then combining them so that you're like, and this goes with the other one, define together the rules, right? Where it doesn't have to, the outcomes don't have to be nonlinear, but we do need to know what our criteria is for what would work. Like, what is it that works in this? Yeah. Oh, I think you're muted now, Kenny, or at least I can't hear you.
Oh yeah, I was.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
I said for what are your criteria for success and what are your criteria for failure? Those are very important.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And so, yeah, I see this one, cognitive load, and I honestly still don't know what to say about that, because, and I think for me, cognitive load is more connected to context switching. So that when people are doing too much context switching, but what is not context switching in nonlinear approaches, right? How do you create boundaries where people aren't doing a lot of context switching without siloing them into too limited a context? I still don't really have, I don't have an answer for that. And also for me, I learned not everyone likes to eat information for breakfast. Like my husband, for example, likes to experience a concept and then think about it a little bit before he starts to talk about it, which is the opposite of what I do. Like, I think by talking about it. Yeah.
The problem is, or the solution is, that it has to become not counterintuitive. It is a context switch because we would do another way. So we have to act and stop and think, and this is counter our ways. So it will be a switch. We have to force ourselves. I put the Cathedral of Cologne there because I think it is one of the best examples. It's even in Fred Book's book. From him, he is the one I know it. It was built in 500 years by, I don't know, 20 architects or something. And the reason why it is so successful and renowned is that it has the same concept. And those architects in 500 years changed the technology, changed their ideas or their wishes. But they forced themselves to keep the original plan and keep to the original plan. And this is why you can say it was built in 500 years by Danish persons.
Yeah, it's one of the challenges. So Brooks says that his idea of conceptual intent, where he landed was one person or a small group of very well think together group of people. And that I've never seen that happen well so far, right? This is what sort of leads to it can seem to command and control. And simultaneously, I've never seen groupthink architect well either. So I don't necessarily go all the way to a design as if it's one architect over, but at the same time, if you go too far away from that, then you end up with the Rube Goldberg machine of stuck together. So I think that's a very interesting example of what Fred Brooks was trying to get to about conceptual integrity.
Yeah, one kind of way to think of it when you're looking at cognitive load is to say, is the old let's take a step back phrase, right? That leads you to, and what I mean by let's see if we can model the context, like get a shared model of what's the context in a solution agnostic way. If we can get a shared understanding of the context in a solution agnostic way, then we can talk about how our solution impacts, and that reduces cognitive load immensely for any group discussion, any collaborative thing, where you can just like step back and say, well, in the context, this is what's happening, so this is my solution. So being able to jump back up and jump back down and look at your details in context, I think is really critical for reducing cognitive load.
Agreed. And it's really amazing too, isn't it? How often you do that and discover you weren't all solving the same problem, you were all solving different problems. Like you're using the same words, but you didn't really perceive the challenge the same way. So you're going around in circles because you're not actually solving the same problem.
Yeah. And the other powerful question I think is there, well, we should do this and just follow it's kind of like the yes and question. Is the and then what happens question. So that helps you shift it back up to outside the well, it's going to have an impact over here, and then okay, then you can step back up to okay, let's model that, make sure we understand we're on the same page. So that's I think that gets some people out of the fighting for their solution thing and just say, okay, that sounds okay, and then what happens? When that happens, then what happens? Until you get to the context and find out if you're on the same page. So it's another trick. If people won't take the and then, let's take a step back. You could just follow the and then what happens till they run over the context boundary. Yeah,
and this is I open Miro boards so much more often now, because if we start moving the little sticky notes around on the board to do this and then, suddenly everybody's focused as if we're working on the same thing together instead of we were opposed before. Now we're like making a story. And that physical aspect seemed to help us also, like putting our hands in it as opposed to just talking about it. It's very interesting and ironic that I came to the conclusion that there's too much talking in tech, because if I'm saying that, how much how must the rest of the world feel? So we start modeling it and we're still talking, but for some reason we seem to progress better.
Yeah, I think you nailed a really important point there, because like externalizing that model and actually it's that practice of, instead of you and I debating, we externalize the thing. Now we're debating, instead of debating each other, we're debating the problem and its fit and all this, that external entity. So it's less competitive by its immediate nature. It's like, this thing is wrong, not you're wrong, that's wrong.
Right.
And that really helps a lot of people.
Yeah, agreed. Very agreed. So I was going to go to self-awareness. Did anyone have anything they wanted to add to conceptual integrity before we move on?
Yeah, one thing that crossed my mind with the linear thinking and the conceptual integrity is future branching, my arch nemesis. Right? For me, it's the same thing, as in you're staying on a branch separated from other people for really long, solving a linear problem. And I'm getting there in the concept of what you're telling. For me, it's like you're out of sync with each other because, right, it's not continuous integration. That's why we have proper continuous integration as a practice, right? Commit on main every day. But for me, it also comes back to, it seems like branching seems a bit linear as well. That was my insight.
Yeah, and it's I think so. I think the trick is if you're working on a branch and a feature branch where you can spend a lot of time inside your boundary, but the intersection between you and other parts of the system is pretty clear, then that's a really safe way to have some boundary, right?
Might be.
But we have to design that to have that. And once we design it, it also changes. So like, it's a nice idea to say, instead of having a silo or like people go forever on one branch, instead we think of it more like an orchestra. Like, I don't play all the instruments in the orchestra, and I don't actually have to know what your piece is. I'm practicing my piece, but we have some way, the boundaries in the system we can experience the way that they also are in harmony. But it requires a lot of future designing in order to, like, that's not a simple thing, right?
No.
So DDD helps us with that, right? Helps us to make those boundaries. And yet we end up in dead ends regularly anyway. And so I think it's just a perennial challenge, right? It's the paradox that if we design better, we won't end up on that branch forever, because that's on the linear thing. If we can design better, but we can't design better, or we wouldn't have gone down that path in the first place, right? So
yeah.
I would say it's the one thing about age that I actually really like. The older I get, the more likely I am to change route sooner. That I'm not as stubborn about staying the path. That's the only, I don't like anything else about aging. Just that. Okay, so this. Energy, that is huge. The thing that gives us energy and the thing that depletes energy is a very, very core idea. As a matter of fact, I've started thinking about this only in those terms, paying attention to there's a book called The Power of Full Engagement, very business coachy language. They're very business coachy language, but boy, are they really do a great job with that question about energy and using energy as the measure, not time, like how much time have I invested in this, but energy and recovering energy and the importance of that, and how when we're not performing, it's almost always related to the math around energy. It really made me think a lot about, and we know this, the Sisyphus thing, right? Like this was in Twitter conversation. I think it was Romeo was saying this about, and I'm like, raise your hand if you have the Sisyphus slide that ends up in almost all of your talks, because that where instead of cultivating awareness, instead of cultivating self-awareness, we're trying to keep changing the external situation again and again and again, and it doesn't change, because instead of cultivating self-awareness, we're trying to cultivate self-awareness in other people, and that doesn't actually work. That we talk about cat herding, right? Like the cat herding, and people who are good, and this is actually a point I'm glad that we came to. So people who are good at nonlinear thinking often end up in glue roles, right? They're the glue that holds it together. They're the people that do the cat herding. Like, nobody gets to be a cat. That's the new rule. That you will keep perpetuating. People good at nonlinear thinking are always trying to glue together things that don't want to stay glued together. So as soon as you stop applying that energy, they'll start to come apart again. And I have yet to see that investment, again, with previous relationship vague comment, I have yet to see that investment actually pay off to transforming, to a system level transforming. And so the investment in energy that actually enables change and supports and structures change, as opposed to just trying to keep behavior going in a direction that it would not necessarily choose, I think is a real key. Yes, and moving. Yeah, which are kind of, and I mean that in the big way, leaving a situation and problem and moving, i.e. walking, or leaving.
So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is if somebody's playing that gluing role, then they're putting a Band-Aid on the bigger problem, where if that role weren't being filled, things would fall apart and people would recognize problems that need repair, rather than having somebody continually Band-Aiding the organization so that it limps along adequately and nobody looks to what needs really fixing.
Yeah, and it also, I have a very radical lately way of looking at this, that there's a lot of information on narcissism and the codependency and these types of relationships. Alanis Morissette has lyrics in a song, "Mind the Empty Bottle with the Holes Along the Bottom," which is one of my favorite ones, right? Mind the empty bottle with the holes along the bottom. And I think in tech, we have what I come to call systemic narcissism. Like we have this sort of quality of cultural narcissism that self-reinforces, and so people often end up playing the Wendy role in a Peter Pan culture. And we see these same patterns that happen in family systems or relational systems, or we see, or politics, we see these same things then happen in tech cultures. And so the thing about that, the bottom, mind the empty bottle with the holes along the bottom, is that you putting your energy in, you might be able to manage the situation, but when you stop, the situation will become unmanageable. And more often than not, they'll just find somebody else to Band-Aid. They're not actually going to change at all. They don't change. They won't then later recognize the impact and come to enlightenment. They're just going to find someone else who's willing to do it. And so the question really becomes, are you going to be that person? You know, is that where you want your energy to go? And we have to do it we do it to some extent, because none of us are enlightened and all of us have blind spots. But I think in tech, it can become very ossified, where these roles are filling, you just go from one narcissistic situation to another and it never really changes.
So my takeaway from that's very, very real for me, is that I need to stop my tendency of trying to solve problems and look at why the problems exist.
Yeah. And then making decisions about, I love again that we made this point about energy, making decisions about the investment of our own energy, not with the external math, like what does it want from me, but what my coach asked me this question, what could you do all day long? Like no resistance, what could you do all day long? And can you imagine working in a situation where 80% of what you do is that? And I'm like, no. No, but I am starting to see that that's in part because of I'm still not skilled at exactly what you so eloquently just described, right? Being able to make that differentiation. And tech pays us good money for the Sisyphus work, right? And you know, I was a single mom that was a writer and an actor before I learned to code, so I like not worrying about where my next meal is coming from. So that helped me. Unfortunately, it also helped me to do the bad behaviors, like the behavior that wasn't helping me, and reinforce that as well.
And that's the deeper question. Why do you want to solve? Right?
Yes.
That's the deeper question. Where does the urge come from to do it? And
Yes.
it's not a bad thing, but everything you like to do is also a point of getting abused too. So you need to know your boundaries. When is it still okay for me to do it, or when does it? What they say, I think, in transactional analysis is symbiotic relationship, right? You only live because you're dependent on each other at some point, because you like to solve problems and other likes their problems to be solved. But
Yes, this
You turn
again with
to
my
the-
previous relationships. Like,
and I think that's the in system thinking. They also call it the shifting the burden to the intervener, right? It's just
Yeah.
if I'm
Right. I think this is something that we all face, and I like the shifting from the cat herding. And maybe I'll bring it back to what Diana said earlier about like when you're like a system thinker, you can kind of see where you believe the pain point is, and then trying to convince anybody that that's the real pain point is almost impossible. Then 6 to 8 months later, someone else comes across it like it's their idea, right? And so then your value is disconnected, right? And you're like working, and you're basically in the meantime you're dealing. So what I'm trying to do, and I've had some success in it, and I continue trying, is looking at this. I'll accept the burden of triaging the problem, because like we're in the everyone wants to just triage the problem, move on, but then you're triaging forever. So I like to use the word triaging instead of cat herding. We'll triage this issue, right? And so whenever we see an issue that's an urgent and important, we look at the two things: one, triage it, and then two, follow up with the root cause investigation. So so that if you want me to take this, I take both. You're giving me permission to take both those actions. And so then now they're convinced the pain is real because they actually participated in the triage, but you're not going to triage that forever. It's like, I'll do that in the short term for the group, but I'm taking on working with you to find out the root cause and make the reasons go away. That's my commitment. So getting that commitment and making that pattern happen is valuable, and connecting it back to, remember we used to triage that and now we don't anymore, gives you permission for the next one. So when you do that, you need to make that final thing visible to everyone. That's your real value, is we don't ever have to do that again. But we tend to move on. We solve the problem, we move on. So making it, when you actually connect it back, we don't do that anymore. A little bit of salesmanship, is important to really connect people to the value you just gave them, because it's, they don't look at value for problems that don't exist.
Yeah, and really paying attention to what happens there. That I make the joke that's not a joke, that my words, 6 to 18 months will start coming back to me, but never in my career with, as Diana said 6 months ago, like that has never ever happened.
Exactly.
But in some situations though, the value feedback loop is pretty consistent. It's not every day, but it's pretty consistent. In other situations, even when that's happened 3 or 4 or 5 times, it still is like, well, yeah, but it's because you said it wrong. If you had said it differently, we would have understood it before. This, if I had $1 for how many times people decided it was because of how I said it that it didn't happen. And so I'm starting to pay exactly the point you're talking about. I'm starting to then pay attention to what happens in that moment. And if there's still a lot of dismissal, right? If there's still a lot of not putting the systems thinking, connecting the systems, the nonlinear thinking to why things are better, then that's a sign as well that the situation is going to take nonlinear thinking, but it's not going to commit to nonlinear thinking, right? So what's the next step from there? Whereas one of the reasons I kept just going forward and not doing the salesmanship is I kind of didn't want to know. Like I kind of didn't want to know if the value part was going to be there. But now I have learned that lesson that you're describing, which is you need to take that pause. You need to make that connection, because that's how you test the health of this change, right? People are starting to recognize it, and little baby steps are fine, but they need to be there.
Yeah, and I think connecting, and I think a couple of the things you touch is really when you look at that, I triage it. Now I'm going to look at the root cause. It's almost, you have to if you wrap that in a hypothesis, you get better permission. So really, that what's my evidence that if I discover what I think is the root cause, what would the evidence be? Like getting people to buy into that and saying, I believe it's one of these two things. So, but if I get it right, if suggestions change, if I get it right, we'll be able to measure the kind of the early evidence here. And then people will buy into, oh, you just want to do an experiment. But we've got a measure of when you're wrong to hold you accountable. So if it goes sideways, I don't have to come back and have a meeting. It's just like when you bring me back that evidence of wrong or right. And so shifting to that is really powerful for buy-in to change, I think.
Yeah.
In my experience.
Yep. Agreed.
We are going out of time, so let's.
Are we?
Yeah.
So, like, I am so sorry that I did
No problem.
not lost total track of time.
Maybe we can do one more.
So let's do one more. So does anyone have a burning? So I do want to say I am going to read these all. I am really grateful. There's some really great stuff, and I'm sorry that I don't have time to read all of it out loud. But I'm going to keep the board up, so anyone else feel free to come back and take a look at the rest of them. But I'm definitely going to go through it and then see what then I can add better for next time. Does anyone have a burning desire for one of the four that we have left? Let's see. Trying to see which looks like somewhere between collective systemic reasoning and respond rather than react has the most. I'm going to go to respond rather than react because I've done whole workshops on this one here, so I tend to get really lost in that and have too much to say when we're over time. Thank you for pointing out, by the way, that we had done that. This one has it. Thank you. Ryan Stiles is, I think, one of the most brilliant improv people on the planet. So I really like that. This is really great. The practice catching your reactions in safe space, low stress situations. So I am in Croatia for a month. So at home, 3 dogs, 2 cats, a ferret, how many chickens now, Dom? Bunch of chickens, little ones, bigger ones, fox trying to eat the chickens, 4 acres. It's springtime, so all the weeds are coming or whatever. And here I am in my room with my patio and my laundry once a week. And it's really interesting how many of my anxiety over work or whatever things still arise, even though I'm not in very high, and my work day doesn't start till 4 p.m. So I have plenty of time to do intellectual creative work during the day, which I thought was my dream, but it is. And so I really am seeing the, how important it is to that exact point is paying attention to your reactions when it's not hot, because you'll discover that so many of them are habitual. Many of them are habitual. Like they're not really about the circumstances. And this, especially curiosity, that's the big, like if we can become curious as opposed to reactive, it shifts the energy a lot, and just practicing yes and can shift. Though I will say, I've also been in situations that are abusive of empathy. You have to be empathetic all the time, but that empathy does not necessarily have to come back from the people who are absorbing all the empathy. So I've had to practice some moderation around that sort of natural, but you can be empathetic also without feeding a pattern that isn't working. And then, yes, okay, this is a very good place to end. Yes, but. This is great. Yes, but. Because I forgot that, but that is the thing. If you take on, okay, I'm going to try yes and for a week as your practice, you will probably discover that what you mostly do is yes, but instead of yes and. And my architecture colleagues, we've been talking about this a lot lately, because in a culture where there's a lot of debate, The yes and didn't get to yes and, it stayed in yes but, like it very stayed in yes but. And so being very careful about that practice, that it's a step in the right direction, but it's not a step off of no. It's a kind of it's a kinder, gentler no. Thank you for putting that one. So this is great. Thank you for everyone who has stayed the extra bit of time. I'm so sorry that I completely lost track and yet
No,
sorry,
you
not
didn't.
sorry.
It's still a few minutes to go, so if anyone has some dire questions, so you were still on time, but just
Okay, good,
I
good.
was looking
Also,
on time.
that's
Usually
nice that time gets
we
away
end
from me.
between 1.5 to 2 hours. So yeah, I'm not sure if anyone has some comments or reactions or diring questions that needs answered now.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Dave.
Diana, how do you present yourself to a potential client? What do you claim your role or value proposition is when you seek a position?
Yeah, that's the hardest question in the world, dude. As that one right there, and I am redoing that again and again, and I've really wrestled with this. So I call myself an enterprise systems architect, and I use problems that I've solved in the industry, you know, client, big brand names, blah blah blah, because that's usually what that's the intersection point people are looking for. And I've also started to focus on artifacts. Like, here are the exercises and workshops and artifacts that I can do with you, so that, you know, we can find the leverage points. But I'm still, I'm working on a book, and one of the feedback from the publisher was, well, this is brilliant and important, but it doesn't speak enough tech, so I should start talking the language. Like, I need to linearize the nonlinear book so that it speaks to what people want in tech books, which of course I can't actually do. And so this has been a very relevant question for me. And even this talk is a huge risk for me, because I don't have any cred. We didn't do any Kafka or Kubernetes except in my jokes, like, right? And so how would I pass a whiteboard test for this? And so I really wrestle with that question. We're doing, though, a keynote at DDD EU, where Andrew from ThoughtWorks, he has started to think of architecture as advice giving, and by advice giving, what he means is what we were talking about here, right? Constructing responses and helping people do collective systemic reasoning. Really, that's what he means. And we're actually going to engage everyone in the keynote to ask them what they think about this, or how does that work in their role. And so I'm really hoping that gives me some insight, because I keep rewriting web page and info, like, I just don't know how. I don't yet have that.
Right.
So
I had a very interesting discussion with two people for the API Resilient podcast, and Mark Bourgeau, can't pronounce his last name. He says, instead of, and it's on the last slide, instead of calling it leadership or something because it's ambiguous, you have Alicia, I can't pronounce her name, Juarero. She talks about constraints as innovation. She calls it cataclysts. Be the catalyst of the system. And that's some insight he gave me, as in trying to rethink. You're there to catalyst the architecture inside the company. So a catalyst isn't the band-aid, but it's like you're catalyzing it through the organization itself by facilitation, advising, etc. So yeah, maybe something with that gave me insight, but yeah, it's
that's a great word.
Chicken and egg one, right? If it's not a hype, you're using something that's not being used, but if you want to make it popular, then how do you go about with the naming?
I say I help paradigm shifters, because Janella Meadows says that the first two the most impactful things to do in system is have the power to shift the paradigm and then be able to know how to shift the paradigm. So that's what I've been like. I help paradigm shifters, people who are doing transformation, but most of the people who think they're doing transformation are not. So then you have to bring the discerning, like, are they really shifting the paradigm? Like, is that really what's happening?
It seems to me like you're helping people articulate what they already know, but if you present it that way, they're not going to hire you.
Right. Yeah. I mean, right. Right. Also, I mean, most of the job in systems architecture, of course, is to tell people that they're wrong, because that otherwise you don't need a systems architect, right? If everybody knew what to do, then they do it and they don't need me to help figure it out. So if they're having me help figure it out, then mostly I'm going to say things that are counter to what, everyone pushing in the wrong direction. And it's not wrong in a condescension way. That's the job, is to come up with the other alternatives. But that part actually is usually pretty straightforward, because people do generally know. And if you do it in a well-reasoned, kind, way, then people generally, that goes well. What is the challenge then is to actually then get action from that recommendation, right? For the momentum to shift. And more often, you just hit another iceberg. More often than not, I just come to think of that as the process of stand up, walk 2 steps, drop, trip. It's just part of the process, right? Yeah. Oh, you're muted.
You're muted, Rick.
Oh, sorry. Dana, I wonder if you could just try something. Try it, like, think about answering this question. I typed it in. What's the burning need that you're uniquely positioned to address? So think of that question, and then just think of, like, when I say, like, what do you do? Don't tell me your role. Don't tell me how you solve the problem. Just talk about, when this situation, people are often in this situation and then they're really struggling this way and they're actively trying, and it's not working for them. That's where I come in, and then talk about your role and how you address that. That's kind of what people have recommended to me is a very powerful way. Wonder you could just riff on that and see what happens.
Yeah, well, that's when I say, and have been saying, from software to systems, that people are going from building a piece of software to systems of software. And that's what I do, especially in knowledge and information systems. Okay.
So that's close, but there's, like, you kind of make that a story, like make it a real situation. For example, like just really like connect it. So someone who doesn't quite understand those 2 words, but would know someone who's having that problem would get. That's kind of the next shift.
Yeah, so this is really validating too, because my early slides are exactly this, right? Like at The Economist and at Wikimedia Foundation, who I've been working with, like to give these exact examples that we are really all, like almost everyone is in, anyone with a knowledge and information system right now is having some challenges that are we might describe them differently, but there's a lot of overlap in the challenges. So the bigger question is that what I want to do? Is that what I want to be doing next year? So we will leave in my nonlinear ambiguity is that really what I think what I want to do now is help people do it as opposed to organizations, but we'll see where that goes.
Great. Thanks, Diana. And I hope to see everyone, or the ones that are privileged enough, see you at DDD Europe. Else there's also Kandinsky in October. Hope to see you there. I already have tickets. The CFP is open as well. But again, thank you very much for joining in, interacting. And Christina, we're back after holiday season, right? Because, take some time off. And if anyone has any ideas, talks, hands-on, or anything else you want to discuss with us, like Diana did today, please feel free to contact us, and see you next time.